The rain pounded hard on the roof that morning, the sound echoing like a drum in my chest. I walked downstairs with a glimmer of hope, imagining that today would be different. It was my birthday, and even though I didn't have high expectations, part of me still believed in some surprise. My parents were smiling in the living room, and my younger brother Josh was elated. When I saw the car keys in my dad's hand, my heart raced. It had to be for me. But then he turned, held out the key, and handed it to Josh. My brother screamed with joy, ran out to the garage, and there it was, a brand new, shiny black car with a red ribbon on top. I froze. My parents looked at me and smiled, as if they'd remembered I existed too. My mother pulled something from behind the couch, an old umbrella with a broken handle and torn fabric. "We thought it would be useful for college," she said, and laughed. My eyes burned, but I held on. I didn't cry. I just clutched the umbrella to my chest as if it meant something. Josh was already honking outside, and my parents followed him as if I were an extra in my own house. I went up to my room, locked myself in, and stayed there for hours. The sound of the new engine echoing down the street was like a knife. It wasn't just about the car. It was about being ignored. That was the first time I felt like I wasn't part of that family the way Josh was. Ever since we were little, he'd always been the favorite. But in that moment, it became official. It was as if my parents had stamped my insignificance with that ridiculous gift. A broken umbrella in exchange for years of effort, good grades, and all-night studying. I still wonder if they realized the cruelty of that gesture. But deep down, I think they did. I think they knew exactly what they were doing, and that's what hurts the most. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was a warning. But for me, that day, it was the end of any hope of being truly seen. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. And it was there, with a punctured umbrella in my hands, that the storm inside me began. From that moment on, something changed, and there was no going back. That night, the house was silent, but my head screamed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Josh's smile behind the wheel, the car's headlights shining like spotlights illuminating my loneliness. My mother walked down the hall, stopped at my door, but didn't knock. I waited. I waited for an apology, a hug, anything, but nothing. The sound of her footsteps receding gave me a clear answer. I was alone. The next day, I went down to the cafe as if nothing had happened. My parents were talking excitedly about the new car, while Josh showed me pictures of him with his friends. I sat at the table and grabbed some toast, but my throat felt tight. My dad looked at me and said, "I hope you take good care of your umbrella. It was your grandfather's." I smiled weakly, but inside, I was broken. It wasn't just a useless gift. It was a cruel reminder that I would always have to make do with leftovers. Every conversation revolved around Josh, his achievements, his desires. When I tried to talk about my college project, I was interrupted. Twice. The third time, my mom was already clearing the dishes, and no one heard. There was no point in trying anymore. I started keeping everything to myself, smiling on the outside and keeping quiet on the inside, because I learned that the less I said, the less it hurt. The following weeks were like a loop of indifference. My parents celebrated Josh in every way, on Instagram, at parties, in conversations with the neighbors. Meanwhile, I was the studious son, the responsible one, the one who didn't cause any trouble. And maybe that was what made me disappear in their eyes. The fact that I didn't yell, that I didn't demand anything. But silent pain also bleeds, and I was starting to bleed inside. It was then that I understood. Either I took control of my story, or I would remain invisible forever. This wasn't just about the present. It was about identity, worth, belonging, and I needed to find a way to show myself to the world, not out of anger, but because I deserved to exist outside my brother's shadow. I began revisiting old memories with fresh eyes. It hadn't started with the car. In fact, since childhood, Josh had always received special treatment, even if no one said it out loud. I remembered the Christmas he broke my video game console and still got a new one the next day, or the time he got bad grades and got a trip to cheer up. Meanwhile, when I got an A+, I got silence. At school, my friends' parents went to the performances. Mine only showed up when Josh was involved. Once, I competed in a science fair and won a gold medal. I waited for them in the audience. They didn't show up. They later said they forgot the time. I smiled. I said I didn't care. But I walked home, medal in my pocket, and tears on my face. That taught me to celebrate alone. I was always the son who fended for himself, the one who got it done. And maybe that's why I was never seen. The problem is that when you're the strong one all the time, people think you don't feel it, that you don't need to be held, to be cuddled, to be cared for. And that crushed me inside. The strength they admired was also the armor that isolated me, and I no longer knew how to ask for attention without appearing weak. I remember crying in the bathroom once, with the faucet running to muffle the sound. My parents were arguing in the living room about how Josh needed more emotional support. I laughed silently. It was like a piece of furniture, useful but forgotten. They never asked how I was. They never wanted to know. Because in their minds, I was always fine. But no one is always fine. And then it hit me. I couldn't expect anything from them anymore. I needed to build a world where I was the center of my own narrative. I might never be the favorite, but that didn't mean I wasn't valuable. I just needed to stop measuring my importance by their yardstick and start creating my own, one that didn't always leave me last. The idea came without warning. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling of my room, when I asked myself, what if I disappeared for a while? Would they notice? The urge to disappear was more about being remembered than running away. I wanted to see if it would make a difference. I didn't talk to anyone. I just packed my backpack, took the bare minimum, and left the broken umbrella on the bed as a symbol. It was a Saturday morning. I left before everyone woke up. I took a bus to a neighboring town and turned off my phone. I walked aimlessly through the streets, feeling a bitter freedom. I was alone, but at least it was by choice. I rented a cheap room in a hostel, using some of the money I'd saved from freelance work. I spent the day walking, writing in a notebook, trying to figure out what I wanted. For the first time, I felt like I was breathing outside my family bubble. On the second day, my phone started ringing. First friends, then my mom. I waited. She left a message. "Are you okay? We need to talk." She didn't say they were worried. She didn't ask where I was. She just wanted to talk. That confirmed what I already suspected. It wasn't about me. It was about the discomfort my absence was causing. Even though I was gone, I was still just a footnote in their drama. On the third day, I got a text from Josh. "Dude, come back soon. Mom's freaking out. You didn't have to put on that whole show." I read it and shook with rage. Show. For him, everything was about attention. It always had been. But it wasn't a performance. It was a pent-up scream. A cry for help transformed into silence. But now I didn't want to go back just to take up space. I wanted to change everything. I wanted to break the cycle. It was there, in that small town, in a musty-smelling room with peeling walls, that I understood. Disappearing wasn't enough. I needed to show up, but in my own way, in my own way, in my own time, in my own voice. And if they weren't ready to hear me, then I would speak to the world. I would tell my story, not to expose, but to liberate, because their silence would no longer silence me. That early morning, unable to sleep, I opened my notebook and began to write. I wrote as if I were talking to my parents for the first time, without fear, without filter. I talked about everything, the times I felt invisible, the wounds they never saw, the words I had to swallow. I talked about the umbrella, the car, the silent injustice that had been with me since childhood. It was like emptying a bucket full of feelings that had been weighing me down for years. I cried as I wrote, but I kept going. It was as if finally my voice was taking shape. When I finished, I felt a strange relief, as if I had cleaned an old wound. I didn't know if I would ever deliver the letter, but it existed, and for me, that was already a victory. For the first time, my pain was organized, with a beginning, middle, and end, and that gave me strength. The next day, I decided to leave the letter at home, next to the damn umbrella. I caught the first bus back and walked in quietly. The house was empty. My heart was racing. I slowly climbed the stairs, entered my room, and saw that no one had touched the umbrella. It was exactly as I'd left it. I grabbed the letter, placed it on top, and left again. Only this time, I didn't run away. I left with dignity. The following week, I continued life as normal, but now with a plan. I began to transform my memories into writing. I created an anonymous blog, where I published stories under fictitious names. It was like shouting to the world, without anyone knowing it was me. And there, in the comments, I found something I never had at home. People who listened to me. People who said, I felt the same way. People who saw me. My parents never mentioned the letter. They never brought it up. Maybe they read it. Maybe they didn't. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I was finally telling my story, my way. I no longer expected them to notice me. Now I noticed myself, and that was the turning point I needed, because from that moment on, I was going to transform pain into movement. The blog started small, but grew quickly. Each post was like pulling a thorn out of my chest. He wrote about exclusion, unfair comparisons, being the forgotten child. And the comments were endless. People said they were experiencing the same thing, that finally someone had said what they'd never been able to put into words. I was moved by each response. It was like forming a new family, one made up of listeners. I started receiving inbox messages, people asking for advice, venting similar stories, sharing scars. I understood that my pain wasn't unique, but it could be useful, and that gave me purpose. I kept writing, day after day, with my heart, until one of the texts went viral. The Invisible Sun, over 1 million views. I ended up on podcasts, and large pages shared it. But what struck me most was one message. You wrote my childhood. That phrase stuck in my head like a mantra. I had written someone's childhood. I had given voice to those who had been silenced. It showed me that, even without my parents' love, I could still be important. Not to them, perhaps, but to the world. To me. The boy with the broken umbrella was now heard, respected, welcomed by thousands of people. And it began with a pain that nearly destroyed me. I began studying writing, public speaking, and emotional communication. I was invited to give lectures on resilience and self-esteem. And there, on stage, I realized this was it. This was the path. All that indifference, all that rejection, had pushed me back to my true place. I only needed to fall to understand how to get back up. And now, I wanted to help others get back up too. But even with all this upheaval, there was still a void, an unfilled hole. The wound with my parents was still raw. Their silence, even with everything happening, still cut like a knife. Did they know? Were they reading in secret? Or did they continue to ignore me, even in the spotlight? The answer was about to arrive, and it would change everything. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was walking home from college when, in the middle of the parking lot, I saw someone leaning against the hood of my old car. I approached slowly and was shocked to recognize him. It was my father. He looked uncomfortable, holding something in his hands. We never saw each other like this, without warning. My heart raced. He looked at me with downcast eyes and said, "We need to talk." For the first time, there was no judgment in his tone. We were silent for a few seconds, until he reached out and handed me the umbrella. The same one, the broken one, but now restored, with a new frame and new fabric. "It's not the gift you deserved, I know, but it's the only way I could find to say I heard you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to throw it away. Another wanted to hug him. I stood there, trying to decipher the absurd scene. He then told me he'd read the letter, that my mother had read it too, that they'd cried silently. "You were always the strong one, and we mistook that for coldness." But reading that was like being punched. His sincerity disarmed me. For the first time, I felt my father was human, fragile, and that broke me inside. He didn't directly ask for forgiveness, but it was there, with the most symbolic gesture he could have made. We sat on the curb in the parking lot. He talked about his favoritism toward Josh. He said it was never intentional, but that he saw everything differently now. "There's no going back, son, but you can walk differently from now on." I listened silently, swallowing 1,000 emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, another, lost. When someone finally sees you, after years, the reflection in the mirror is almost strange. We said goodbye without hugs, but with a new kind of silence, that of someone who, perhaps, is trying. I took the restored umbrella with me. I stashed it in the trunk. It didn't fix the past, but it was a symbol, and symbols matter. It was the beginning of something I didn't even know I wanted anymore. But that, deep down, I still needed. A few days later, it was my mother who came looking for me. She showed up at school, unexpectedly, with red eyes and a cake in her hand. She said, "I didn't know what to bring, so I brought what I made when you were sick." My stomach churned. I remembered the times she'd bring me cake when I had a fever, but she'd forget to ask me how I felt inside. She tried to smile. I let her. We sat on a bench on campus. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I didn't know we hurt you so much, and it hurts knowing you grew up believing you weren't loved." The words came slowly, broken by guilt. She talked about how she thought silence was a form of respect, that, not disturbing, meant supporting. but now she realized how absent she'd been when I needed her most. We stayed there for almost an hour. She talked. I listened. Then I reversed roles. I told her everything, uncensored, about the anger, the emotional abandonment, the envy I'd hidden for Josh. She cried a lot. She apologized, truly, and for the first time she hugged me tightly, unhurriedly, a hug that felt like it wanted to stitch together the lost years. I closed my eyes and let that moment run through me like a lightning bolt. When we parted, she cupped my face and said, "You've been the pillar of our home, even in silence, and now I want to hear you, always." They were simple words, but long awaited. My heart still bore scars, but in that moment, they didn't hurt as much, because someone finally looked at me, not as the perfect son, nor as the strong son, but as someone who also needed to be loved. I returned home that night with a lump in my throat. Reconciliation didn't erase the past, but it opened a new path, a path I wasn't sure I trusted yet, but I was willing to try, because despite everything, I wanted to believe that families could rebuild, even after so many mistakes, even after a broken umbrella. A few days after reconciling with my parents, there was only one piece missing: Josh. He sent me a curt message, asking to talk. We met at a coffee shop near our house. When he arrived, he still wore his school jacket and that same confident smile, but his eyes were different, less arrogant, more heavy. He sat across from me as if he knew he owed me something, but didn't know where to begin. "I read your blog," he said bluntly. "I read everything. Some things pissed me off, others broke me." I took a deep breath. I didn't know how to react. Josh had always been the center of the universe in our house, the darling, the chosen one. But here, for the first time, he seemed lost. I never realized how much I was favored. In my head, "You were the nerd who didn't care about any of this," he added, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. I said little, letting him talk. It was his moment to listen to his own conscience. He said the car was a shock when he understood its symbolism. "I got a car, and you got a reminder that you were invisible. How could we have missed that?" There was sincerity in his voice, but also a shrunken, shy guilt, as if someone was still trying to grasp the magnitude of their own mistake. I stared at him and let the silence weigh heavily between us. After a while, I said, "I don't blame you for everything, but you benefited from a system that hurt me, and you never questioned it." He nodded, his eyes downcast. He said he was trying to change, that he didn't want to repeat that pattern in his life. "I'm seeing a therapist now, because of you, because you had the courage to speak up." Those words took me by surprise. Seeing Josh seeking help was something I never imagined. We said goodbye with a lingering handshake, almost a hug that never quite ended. There was still distance between us, but now it was a conscious distance. We knew what separated us, and that, in itself, was a start. On the way back, I felt a strange lightness, as if the old pain was slowly beginning to heal. Josh was no longer my enemy. He was just another survivor of that same house. With everything that was happening, my story began to attract the attention of publishers. A literary agent wrote to me, saying he saw potential for a book. I was in shock. I never imagined my pain would become a printed page. He said, "You don't just have a story, you have a voice." We began working on the project together, and within a few months, I was writing my first book, The Son of the Broken Umbrella. The nights were long. Reliving each memory was like opening wounds that had barely healed, but it was also liberating. I could choose the tone, the intensity, the details, and more than that, I controlled the ending. Writing was my poetic revenge, not against my parents or my brother, but against the silence that had nearly swallowed me. Each chapter was a scream that had previously been stifled within. The day I saw the finished cover was one of the most exciting of my life. It was simple, yet powerful. An open umbrella, tied with a red ribbon, flying against the wind. That was me, no longer broken, but rebuilt. We launched the book online first, and the response was surreal. Thousands of copies sold in the first few weeks. Comments, emails, people saying they cried, that they saw themselves in every line. My story wasn't just mine. It belonged to many others. And this gave me even more purpose. I began to be invited to discussion groups, schools, universities. My voice, the one that had been ignored for so long, now echoed in packed auditoriums. And all this because one day, I decided to no longer accept silence, because a broken umbrella can become a flag if we know how to hold it. I still remember the first lecture where my parents sat in the audience. I saw my mother cry. I saw my father give me a standing ovation. And in that moment, I understood. Pain left unsaid destroys you, but pain transformed into words rebuilds you. And more than that, it builds bridges, the ones I thought would never have a chance to exist. With the book released and my story echoing everywhere, something still needed to happen. I needed to find myself again, not as the forgotten son, nor as the famous writer, but as myself, without labels. I took a weekend off and returned to the small town where I had once hidden. The same hostel, the same musty-smelling room, but now, with different eyes. I wasn't running away. I was coming back. I walked the streets as if revisiting an old dream. I sat on the bench in the square where I wrote the first letter. I opened my old notebook, now yellowed at the edges, and reread everything. The pain was still there, recorded, but it no longer burned. It was like looking at a scar, the memory of something that hurt deeply, but now no longer bled. That version of me, lost, silent, looked back at me through those pages, and I was grateful that he hadn't given up. On my last night there, I put a new letter in my room, not for my parents, but for myself. I wrote everything I wished I had heard back then. You matter, even if no one says it. You are enough, even if no one sees it. One day it will all make sense. I left the letter in my nightstand drawer, like a gift for the next lost person who might pass by. It was my way of giving something back to the universe. I returned home at peace. For the first time, I felt whole, not because I'd fixed everything, but because I'd stopped waiting for everything to be fixed. I accepted that some cracks are part of us, that you can't put all the pieces back together, but you can use them to build something new. And that, for me, was freedom. It was finally being able to breathe without a weight on my chest. In a way, I had forgiven myself for having accepted so little for so long, for having remained silent, for having doubted myself. And now I understood that growing up isn't just about maturing. It's also about learning to take care of yourself, even when no one else does it for you. This reunion with myself was more important than any external reconciliation, because it was the starting point for everything that would come after. Years later, my family was different. Not perfect, but real, with room for mistakes, forgiveness, and truths. One Sunday afternoon, we were all gathered at my parents' house. Josh, now the father of a daughter, was playing in the backyard. My parents were preparing lunch, and as I watched everything unfold, I realized a new cycle had begun. But something caught my attention. The car keys. The same car from years ago. It was still there, hanging on the kitchen wall. It was just an object, but to me, it was the marker of everything. I took the key in my hand. I weighed it. I remembered the pain, the injustice, the emptiness, but I also remembered how much it pushed me to forge my own path. I took a deep breath and walked over to Josh. I handed him the key. He looked confused. "Why?" he asked. I smiled. "Because now, I have my own path." He understood without needing further explanation. Sometimes, peace comes not when everything is said, but when there's nothing left to say. With that gesture, I closed a chapter, not to forget, but to seal it. My parents looked at me with tears in their eyes, and my mother said, "You taught us to be better. Thank you for not leaving for good." And all I could respond with was a hug, a strong one, unhurried. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you isn't a car, nor an apology. It's time. It's the willingness to relearn, to look again, to truly listen. And there, in that backyard, with my niece laughing in the grass, I realized history had transformed, and what began as pain became an emotional legacy, a story that would make that new generation grow up differently. I left the past where it belonged, like a book on a shelf, not to ignore it, but to remember where I came from. And whenever I look at that restored umbrella, now hanging in my office, I'll know I survived, not just the scorn, but the temptation to become bitter because of it. And that, for me, was the greatest victory. After the book, invitations came from places I never imagined I'd set foot in. Public schools, underserved communities, support centers. People who'd never had a voice now found themselves in my words. And this gave me a new mission, to bring hope where there was only silence. Each talk was a mirror, because in each face, I saw parts of myself. Parents would come to me after the events, crying, saying they didn't know how much they hurt their children with veiled favoritism. Children would hug me tightly, as if they wanted to shout, Thank you for saying what I never could, and I would just listen. I learned that sometimes it's not about having the answers. It's about being the right question at the right time. I transformed pain into a tool. I founded a social project called Children of Silence, which offered listening and emotional support to invisible youth. The project grew quickly, and for the first time I wasn't just carrying my story, I was carrying many. It was as if, together, we formed an army of emotional survivors, ready to break the cycle. And then I received a letter, handwritten, from a 13-year-old boy, saying he was going to give up on life until he found my text. I cried. I held the letter to my chest. In that moment, I understood. My story saved someone, and that's worth more than any forgiveness I could have received. My scar became a beacon, and the umbrella, a symbol of collective protection. My parents attended a project event. They sat front row. They saw the impact of it all, and they told me afterward, "You transformed what we destroyed into something that heals others." For the first time, I felt they saw me not just as a son, but as a man, as someone who was reborn from his own abandonment and chose to lift others up with it. I returned to the garage where it all began. The car was gone, but the space remained the same. I leaned against the wall, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes. This was it, where I had been forgotten, where I felt anger, humiliation, silence. But now it didn't hurt as much, because the memory had lost its weight, and the present was too full of meaning. Josh appeared soon after, with his daughter in his arms. "She wants to hear your umbrella story," he said. I sat on the floor and told her everything, like an old tale. She laughed, was scared, cried, and in the end, she hugged me. "You are strong," she whispered. And then I realized I was now a role model, not of success, but of resilience. And that was all. My parents moved out of their old house. They gave me the restored umbrella in a glass frame. This is more valuable than any car we could give away. I placed the frame in my new office, not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof of overcoming. Because sometimes the worst beginnings yield the best destinies. That night, I wrote another chapter, not to publish, just for myself, to remember that all pain needs time, voice, and space to transform, that every tear I held back brought me here, and that anger, when it matures, becomes a seed. Today, I am the fruit of that. And most importantly, I stopped waiting for recognition. Now I recognize myself, and that is freedom. Today, I look back without anger, only with clarity. The broken umbrella was the push life gave me to show me who I really was. Not the invisible son, but the man who chose not to repeat the silence he received. I wouldn't change a thing, because if it weren't for abandonment, I wouldn't have found my voice, and it became my shelter, my foundation, my bridge to the world. They gave me a broken umbrella. I built an entire house with it. Pain taught me more than love given badly. And today, I know that everything I lacked back then, I can be for myself and for others. What was once empty is now power, and no one can take that away from me. I didn't need a car, nor applause. I just needed to listen to myself, and when I did, the world finally heard me. And maybe that's what was missing all along. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment about where you're listening from, and remember, sometimes the greatest gift is becoming someone no one expected you to be.